I have to start by saying, as Dave did in his session, I feel slightly like an imposter here because I'm not a comic book or superhero aficionado. When we first had the idea of this conference, I said to Aaron, can I do a session on The West Wing or Gilmore Girls or The Handmaid's Tale or Suits or Inception? Those are more my style. And so I come to this Wonder Woman movie in a sense as someone who comes from it as a bit of an outsider. And so I'm going to give you a bit of an outsider's perspective. I grew up, in the 80s. The Wonder Woman TV series was on, and I never really was interested in it. I think there are some reasons now looking back for that, reasons why I wasn't keen on it. So I'm kind of approaching the recent movie, is what we're talking about, the 2017 Wonder Woman movie, as a standalone. For me, when I go to the movies, generally I come out and I either loved it or I hated it and I want to talk about it. It's only if it's in the middle that I don't want to talk about it. It's kind of like, yeah, whatever. But if I either loved it, I just come out like, and then I want to talk about it, or I've had real problems with it. And so what you might get from me is a bit of idealism and a bit of naivety, because I walked out of this movie and just went, I loved it. I really did. I came as a complete outsider. And as some of my friends have said, I walked out and I went, now I get why guys are into superhero movies. I've never had that experience before. So the way that I look at it is this: how would I then start to want to talk about this movie, particularly with my non-Christian friends? What is it in this movie that A, provided a window into understanding something of what's going on in our culture that I can connect with? And B, is there anything in this movie that reflects something of what I believe about the gospel and ways that can form connection points and conversation starters that I can connect with? So that's essentially how I want to approach this. How does this Wonder Woman film, this year's film, and its popularity in particular, the reason that it was so beloved, particularly by people who aren't, comic book people, who aren't superhero people, outsiders like me, what does it have to say to us about our culture and what's going on? How does it speak into perhaps some contemporary issues that the church needs to be addressing, and where does it resonate with the gospel? And that's a really broad topic, so I've narrowed it down to 2 areas, so I'm probably going to skip out a lot. But I want to consider those questions in relation to 2 key related topics, and it's gender and humanity. I should note, there are certainly some aspects of this movie that can and should deserve to be critiqued, but I'm going with the positives because it resonated with me as a non-comic book woman. So I want to ask whether Wonder Woman captured something of what I'm calling a wider cultural moment around perspectives on women. And if so, how understanding that moment can help the church speak well into that context. And then at the end, I also want to consider Wonder Woman's anthropology, if you like, its theology of humanity, and how that might echo and point towards the gospel of Jesus Christ. So Wonder Woman hit screens in the middle of this year, I think carrying just a few small expectations of a few different people. Producers were hoping that she would essentially save the DC franchise after a couple of commercial flops. Women in Hollywood were hoping that she would prove that a female-led film can make money at the box office. I think women everywhere were hoping that she would be the right kind of woman and feminist icon. And in terms of the story, she just had to save the world in the meantime. So I think she certainly succeeded in the first 2 of those in terms of popularity, recognising that the film not only broke box office records for a female-driven and female-directed film, but at the same time smashed her fellow male superheroes on the way. Watch this meme. Whether she was as successful at representing women as how they aspire to be represented, or in teaching us how the world can be saved, I think are more complicated questions. But before we get to those, I think it's worth asking, why was there so much expectation on this movie? And what did Wonder Woman need to prove? And to answer that, I think we need to pause for a minute and go back and ask a wider context question about how women in particular have been commonly portrayed in film. And fortunately, there's actually a dedicated research institute which focuses on answering just that exact question. It's called the Gina Davis Institute on Gender in the Media, named after a founder that, if you're old enough, you might remember as an actress in her day, until perhaps her combination of gender and age led to her disappearing from a number of screens. The Institute's website is cjane.org, and I'd highly recommend looking at some of their reports. And their basic starting point is this: that while women and girls make up 51% of the population in the real world, they have made up less than a quarter of the population in the mainstream entertainment media for decades. And so one good example, the Institute conducts a study of a couple of years called Gender Bias Without Borders, an investigation of female characters in popular film. Hey, it seemed to resonate with what I was talking about today. So in 2012, they looked at 120 top films for that year, and they found a number of broad themes around women's portrayal in popular films, and this really hasn't changed in decades. So 4 key themes. The first is that women continue to be invisible. 71% of movie characters are men, in all movies, in all popular movies, not just action movies. 29% are women. Only 22% of films, that's less than 1 in 4, have either a female lead or co-lead. So a female in the top billing at all. So clearly in this area, movies actually aren't a reflection of cultural reality at all. They're not a mirror, because I'm pretty sure most of us live in a world where the male to female ratio is roughly 1:1. Yeah? But if movies are more than windows of culture, if they're actually culture shaping, which is what I believe, they not only reflect culture, they shape culture, what do girls learn about their place in the world if they are literally not seen half of the time? Second thing the study found is that women are often voiceless. So despite the reputation women have for being the talkers, in the movies, male characters talk at least twice as often as their female counterparts. There's a website called The Pudding that undertook last year the most comprehensive analysis of movie scripts ever. They looked at 2,000 film scripts, and they analysed the scripts, so every detail, every word spoken, to see how many words were spoken by men and how many words were spoken by women. Of those 2,000 films, 1,513 of them had men speaking 60% or more of the time. Bizarrely, get this, even the movie Frozen, which has 2 female leads, has male characters speaking 57% of the dialogue. It blows my mind. In action movies, of course, the stats are much higher. Batman, Avengers, Captain America all have male characters speaking between 80 and 90%. Star Wars movies, Lord of the Rings, that goes up to 96%. So when women don't hear their voices reflected in popular culture, how does it impact on how they use their voices in real life? Is it a wonder that we tend to perceive women as talking more than they do if we've actually been enculturated to think that they don't talk much at all? Thirdly, women are trivialised. Interestingly, in the Gina Davis study, they studied the ratio of male to female characters in various professional roles, which is just one indicator of power and status. Here are some findings. For characters who are doctors, there are 5 men for every woman. For characters who are lawyers, there are 10 men for every woman. Academics or professors, 15 men for every woman. Judges, 20 men for every woman. And perhaps the profession with the biggest disparity is actually clergy, with 50 men portrayed for every woman on screen. Now, they didn't look at the profession of superhero, but we could probably do our own analysis and get a guess about that. But when women's roles are predominantly minor, supporting, trivial, again, what message are we sending to girls about where they might find their place in the world? And fourthly, and probably most obviously, women are sexualised. Unsurprisingly, women are more than twice as likely as men to be shown naked in films, 3 times as likely to be in revealing clothing, and 5 times as likely to have comments made about their physical appearance. The very fact that most of the stories our culture is telling are being written and told by men means that women often feel that they are portrayed as objects of male desire or male perspective rather than as rounded characters in their own right. So if these are the films that are both reflecting and shaping our culture, what are we telling women about their place? Or is it any wonder that William Moulton Marston, creator of the original Wonder Woman comics book, said this: "Not even girls want to be girls, so long as our feminine archetypes lack force, strength, and power." So I think it's that context that's really important for understanding what happens when Wonder Woman comes along this year and captures the imagination of a lot of women. It's against this backdrop that Diana's portrayal feels really unusual and really inspiring. I think it taps into a frustration and a desire that many women in our culture feel and want to speak about how they are often portrayed. So many people have called Wonder Woman a feminist icon, and certainly she is both empowered and empowering. She's heroic, she's brave, she's strong, all the things that men usually are. She is the protagonist of her own story, and the men around her are not threatened by her. They're not emasculated by her, they actually seem to celebrate her. But she's also clearly feminine. She's beautiful, and I would suggest she's not over-sexualised. I was quite surprised. I thought, given this is a blockbuster movie, it would be much more so. In terms of character attributes, she is emotionally vulnerable, idealistic, perhaps naive, compassionate, values hope and love, and these things are kind of seen as weaknesses rather than strengths. She doesn't have a complicated vengeance-based bitter backstory, but is motivated by love and altruism. And so Patty Jenkins, director of the movie, said the greatest thing about Wonder Woman is how good and kind and loving she is, yet none of that negates any of her power. I would say she is allowed to be more than one thing at one time. And that's something that has generally been reserved for men in the movies. Or, as one of my friends, Tammy Davis, said, she's a great role model for girls, or, for any human being. I would also note that the Amazon warriors of Themyscira too are the kind of women that you don't often see portrayed on screen. They are visually feminine, but again, I'd say not overtly sexualised. I mean, they're mainstream characters in a Hollywood movie, so, But they are fierce and not passive, and they are athletic and they're not fragile. They are strong and powerful, and it's been pointed out to me that actually when they fight collaboratively, and they actually work together and talk about what they're doing, which is often considered a particularly feminine strength. And it's rare to see that. It's actually rare to have more than one character on screen at the same time in a lot of movies. And here we have half an hour of a movie where there is only women on screen. And it's quite unusual to see. So I want to suggest it's not that Diana and her tribe are some perfect idealised version of women, although there's elements of that because it is still a movie. I want to argue that what makes them most inspiring to women is that they were fully formed three-dimensional characters. After seeing so many movies where women are one-dimensional caricatures of what it seems like a man thinks a woman should be, Wonder Woman presents us with a complex character, dare I say, a woman who is allowed to be both kick-ass and compassionate at the same time. So what are women seeing in Diana? Is it a reflection of something of themselves, or maybe for some, but I think for most of us, it's actually that we see a reflection of our aspirations. We see something of what we would like to be and how we would like other people to see us. She is not invisible. She is not voiceless. She is not trivialised, and she's not overly sexualised. Go, Wonder Woman. And throughout the movies, there's like a bunch of assumptions that the men make about her, and she just upends them one after another to make sure that she is fully heard and fully seen. And I think that fired up people's imagination about what women can be. Now, I'll put a caveat on this time. I think one fair critique of the movie would be it's still only one woman who gets to do that. She actually doesn't make space for anyone else. It's been a big kind of discussion, I think, in feminist circles, the idea of amplification. Often one woman is kind of allowed to break through the glass ceiling, but then she's there, we've got the token woman, we're done. What would it look like to open up space for more? But I've talked to many of my female friends, read a lot of reviews, responses online, and woman after woman talked about how much they loved the scene in the middle of the movie where Diana is told there's nothing anyone can do to help. And she refuses to listen, and she runs out into no man's land and draws all the enemy fire, saves the day, and allows the men to do the thing that they've been waiting to do. And so I wondered, why did this resonate so strongly for so many women? Could it be that they are sick of seeing themselves only portrayed as the sidekick, or the damsel in distress, or the love interest, or the token beauty? And could it be that deep down within all of us, women and men, we long to find a place to contribute, to make a difference in the world, to actually, to find our place and make a difference, so that when we see it happening, we kind of want to stand up and cheer. There's also been some, critiques from a feminist perspective of the movie. There are some problematic issues, i.e. Diana falls in love with the first man literally she ever meets. There's a few issues like that, but I want to suggest that for many women, something in this movie kind of crystallises something that's happening in our wider culture that we would do well as Christians to pay heed to. It is kind of a reclaiming of women's voices and their experiences, not to privilege them above that of men, but to put them alongside and say, hey, this perspective is valuable too. It has something to offer. And one way that I found helpful to tap into that cultural moment was just looking at a taste of the responses that some women shared online to the movie. I love this one. I've lived to see my childhood princesses become generals. You've got Diana's aunt Antiope, played by Robin Wright, who 44 years earlier was Princess Buttercup in The Princess Bride. Hey, maybe I could have done that. And there she is alongside Star Wars Carrie Fisher, who also, between 1983 and 2016, graduated from princess to general. Women want their on-screen representatives to move beyond the limited stereotypes because we too want a full range of possibilities for our futures and for our daughters' futures. What about this one, which links Wonder Woman with a quote by Google and Yahoo executive Marissa Mayer? Maybe the princess can save herself. That sounds like a pretty good story too. Is it possible, women are asking, that they can be the protagonists of their own stories? This is another moment, I think, that captured something when Steve Trevor says to Diana, I can't let you do that. I can't let you do this. That's not just a line that's familiar to us from the movies. I would suggest that that is a line that many women have heard too many times in too many different contexts in their lives. Particularly in a world of yes, all women and Me Too, and an industry of Harvey Weinstein, what does it mean for women to be able to say, what I do is not up to you? How do women want to take back their agency? A couple of others, power, grace, wisdom, wonder. Women want to see our strengths not only portrayed, but valued, whether they are things that we share in common with men, or whether they're attributes that are seen as particularly feminine. To be female is not a weakness. It's not a disadvantage. It is to have a unique contribution to make, which I think is why this reclaiming over the last few years of the phrase, fight like a girl, something not to be ashamed of or embarrassed of, but to be proud of. And perhaps Wonder Woman is the epitome of that. And then finally, I liked this one. We are all Wonder Women. Because while Diana herself, in many ways, is not like most of us, like I know that I'm not that like her in a lot of ways, she is at least one of us for women. And so it inspires women to consider what it means to be their own unique selves and do so together. So how does a Christian respond to this kind of cultural moment that we're seeing captured in the response to this portrayal? I think you could argue that some of those memes portray desires and aspirations that reveal women's human pride and selfishness. That's absolutely true. But in a cultural context where women have often been underrepresented and undervalued, I want to argue that it also reveals our God-given identity and humanity as those created in the image of God, with gifts and a calling and a purpose and an invitation to participate in the renewal of all things. If what we're hearing is women in our culture crying out for more in how they are seen and heard and embodied and experienced and represented and valued, I think we're hearing a cry that comes from the very heart of God. And unfortunately, the church has a reputation in our culture in this area that is actually not that dissimilar to the reputation of action movies. That is a reputation of assigning women a second-class status and a subordinate role. And whether that is fair or whether that has been intentional, I think are distractions from a more important question. It is worth asking ourselves as Christians, have we been telling the story of God in ways that minimise and overlook the place of women? Is the very fact that most of our stories have also been told by men, and from a male perspective, certainly publicly, one that leaves out an important perspective that invites and inspires imagination in women of who they're created to be and who they are called to be in Christ. I think that women in the Bible are not an afterthought. They're not a sidekick, even though perhaps they've sometimes been devalued as such. Women are invited to be co-heirs with Christ and full participants in the work of the gospel. And the Bible does the same thing. It seeks to expand our imagination of what women can be, of what men can be, of what we're all called to. A number of scholars have noted that the portrayal in this movie of women as warriors might seem unusual to us, but the Bible uses military language for women right from the very start. The creation of the first woman, she is called an Ezer, which is a Hebrew word meaning a source of strength or power or help, and it's most commonly used for God in a military context. What does it mean to think of God creating women as warriors in their own rights? So for me, I think that in itself is a powerful contact point with the gospel that we can hear and respond to. As women and men of faith, if we believe in a God who created each of us and values each of us and calls each of us to participate in his mission, how can we speak words of hope and imagination and inspiration to women in our culture and let them know that they are invited to be part of God's story, part of the big story that we're all caught up in? That story is a story of hope and purpose for everyone, for women and men. It's also a story of grace, and that's kind of where I want to shift to finish my thoughts on this topic. How we consider how this film might speak to us about the gospel and culture is its portrayal of humanity. Now, this is where I'm getting more into the actual storyline of the movie. I'm assuming that most of you have seen it, yes? You probably know it better than I do. I've seen it a couple of times. But what does the storyline of Wonder Woman have to say about who we understand ourselves to be, and how does it tap into our culture's understanding of the human experience? And I found it a little bit unusual. I may be coming again, as I said, as an outsider to some of this universe, but how does this resonate with the good news? Because in the end, we discover, as I'm sure you know, that Diana is not human after all. She's a god. So she's not a superhuman superhero, she's actually transcendent or divine. And so we embrace the idea in this movie that salvation comes from outside of humanity. It comes from the divine. We need someone who is not like us in order to save us. And I think that's a truth that's perhaps not often spoken in many aspects of our culture. It's only found in this kind of universe. And so how do we tap into that is worth explaining and teasing out and talking about that one. But I think for me the real connection point is not so much the echo of the divine, but the posture and the relationship she has with humanity. Now I know there are going to be people who disagree with me on this, but generally thinking about this, there are gods who smite and there are gods who punish and there are gods who are angry and there are gods who turn away. And in Diana we have an example of a God who loves. The climactic moment in the film, you've got Ares, the god of war, and he reveals to Diana that if he is not, as she had thought, actually responsible for humanity's war after all. She had made an assumption that is actually the conventional wisdom of our day, that humanity at their heart are basically good. And Ares disabuses her of that notion and tells her that she is actually wrong, that humanity has a wickedness within that he doesn't actually put on them, he just draws it out of them. It already exists within them. He doesn't cause evil and darkness, he says. It's humanity's own hatred within that drives their destruction of one another. I find that really interesting, certainly in my cultural experience, where people don't want to talk about things like sin, where people want to say that people at heart are basically good. How does this provide a connection point for me to talk about the brokenness that is taught in the gospel story and the need that we have for someone outside of ourselves for salvation? So everything falls apart. Diana loses the man that she loves and comes face to face with the evil woman who caused her destruction. And there's this possibility that she could choose to give up on humanity. And I had a disagreement with a friend who said the thing they didn't like about the movie was that in the end she chooses to save the world because of a man. I'm not convinced that she does, because unlike what Paul was saying before about Superman and Lois Lane, at this point Steve is dead. So she's not actually trying to save him. And so she talks about love, but it isn't just for him, it's actually her experience of love for humanity that causes her to want to save them. And before she'd left Themyscira, her mother had said to her, they don't deserve you. And throughout the movie there's this running theme about what humanity deserves. And she has to make a choice. And she realises at this moment they don't deserve her. They don't deserve to be saved. They don't deserve any of it. And she can walk away. But she chooses to save them, as she says, because she believes in love. I would use the word grace for what she's talking about, but I guess I would say I would have a conversation with my friends who I'd seen the movie with and say, well, what kind of love is that? Is it just romantic love? Is it just the desire to be with the man who has suddenly is actually not there anymore? Or is there something bigger going on here, again, that taps into something that resonates with the gospel? There's a opening and closing of the film is framed with these two quotes that she has. At the beginning of the film, she says, I used to want to save the world, this beautiful place, but I knew so little then. It is a land of magic and wonder worth cherishing every way, but the closer you get, the more you see the great darkness simmering within. And mankind is another story altogether. And then at the very end of the film, she comes back and says, I used to want to save the world, to end war and bring peace to mankind. But then I glimpsed the darkness that lives within their light and learned that inside every one of them, there will always be both. A choice each must make for themselves, something no hero can ever defeat. And now I know that only love can truly save the world. So I stay, I fight and I give for the world I know I can be. This is my mission now, forever. That's probably a pretty classic superhero speech at the end of a movie. But what I find fascinating about it is the doors that it opens up, the possibilities of connection points and contrast points with this story and the story that I live in, the story of the gospel that I believe is the story of the invitation that I want to be sharing with my friends who are living in a culture that is telling a very different story. So I think what she chooses here when she chooses to save humanity is what I would call grace, because she chooses to give herself to them despite knowing that they don't deserve her. And I think that's a story that echoes the message of the gospel, undeserved mercy or grace. You can debate, therefore, whether Diana is a Christ figure. And I know that word can be used in a couple of different ways. Is it just about seeing someone who looks a bit like Jesus and saying, hey, here's a connection point with the gospel? Is it that simple? Perhaps sometimes. Then there seems to be this kind of whole world where the term Christ figure has been used, and I think Paul did a good job of kind of unpacking that with Superman and how that can be problematic. But at least in some sense here, what she does is an echo of what Jesus does. Two interesting things about that. Firstly, that she's female. And I don't know if we're used to seeing female Christ figures as often. There are some that people argue are there, but that perhaps messes with our thinking. But it also means it probably, on its face, helps us because we're not in any sense confusing her with Jesus. Right? So the confusion between Jesus and Superman kind of doesn't happen because she looks so different, she is so different. She's not Jesus. So hopefully without even having to over-explain it, we can deal with some of those issues that we're not saying she is Jesus. We're not trying to get into a philosophical debate about what a Christ figure is. We're just trying to point out to people, hey, here's how that story works. Here's how this story works. Do you see there's actually a connection? That what you found so powerful about that story, I can actually tell you a better story that has that same power and actually even goes further. Some reviewers have noted, gone a bit further. Where am I? There's a couple of scenes towards the end when she actually takes the wrath of Ares and turns it back on him, and she's lifted up with her arms outstretched. And you go, is that a deliberate echo of the cross? Seems pretty unlikely. Is it an unintended cultural hangover from the pervasiveness of Christianity in mainstream American culture? Probably not. Is it completely coincidental? Maybe. What I do know is whether you want to go into that level of detail or not, there's some kind of connection point here with the gospel, a conversation starter, a reminder that stories of sinfulness and the need for a saviour, that stories of human weakness and the need for grace actually do still resonate with our culture today. I think we've been telling ourselves in the church that story doesn't resonate, that you can't preach that, that's not what people want to hear and we have to find another way in. For me, this is an example that maybe it's not about the story that's the problem, it's the way that we've been telling it. Because I don't think my average Australian movie-going friend would use the same language I use for what's going on here, but I do think they find this powerful, and I do think they feel and resonate with something of it. And so the question is, can I surprise them with the fact that this actually echoes and resonates the gospel story? And can I actually introduce them to a story that they think is about something else and has a turn to it? What I mean by that is a lot of people in our culture seem to think the Christian story is a story of do's and don'ts. Do this, don't do that. It's a story of morality, it's a story of rules, it's a story of outdated ideas, empty rituals, and hypocrisy. How surprising is it for them to hear that it's a story about the depths of these kinds of ideas and ideals? How do we retell our story in a way that resonates with people in this kind of culture? Here we go. Final thing I want to say, and then we have some questions and discussion. The thing about echoes of the gospel is that echoes are only ever going to be an imitation of the real thing. And so we might find resonance in these stories between what our culture is telling as a story and the story of the gospel, but we also have opportunities not only to connect them, but to contrast them. That quote that she ends the movie with, Wonder Woman says that there is a darkness that lives within that no hero can defeat. And she's wrong. The story of Jesus is the ultimate story because he doesn't just show us grace and rescue us from the destruction our sin has caused, but in his resurrection, he actually defeats death and sin and darkness once and for all and opens up a way for us to be restored, transformed, changed, made whole and made holy. And I'm not sure that's a part of the gospel story that we've done so well at telling either. I'd probably suggest that all superhero stories in our culture ultimately fall short because they can't imagine a story that is so transcendent, so extraordinary, so incomparable that it could actually fundamentally change the nature of humanity once and for all. The gospel story is that big, that surprising. I'm not sure that I fully understood it, let alone being able to tell it in a way that embraces and invites people into that Jesus' grace us, and it makes us like him, and it comes with the promise that one day we too will defeat death and be raised imperishable and be superheroes. That's probably going too far. But certainly it's a story of wonder. So that's my thoughts. I'm happy to take your thoughts or your questions, whether you want to go in the same directions I went in or completely different directions. It's over to you. Just undo. Oh, that's okay.
Do you think that the idea of the self-sacrificing love is the strongest component at the end?
Of this movie or of the gospel story? In the movie? It's interesting, isn't it? If this was any other movie, I think it would be. I think because it's the first female-led superhero movie, there's some other stuff that's probably even more powerful. So that's where I found. It's funny, when I prepared this talk, I was thinking I wanted to spend less time on the gender stuff and more time on the gospel stuff, and it ended up being the opposite, because I think that's where this movie has resonated culture-wise. And so for me to then go in and, again, I was trying to imagine what it would be like to sit down with my non-Christian friend after this movie. And if I wanted to keep turning the conversation to the gospel, and they're like, but this is about how I'm feeling as a woman and how inspired I am. So yeah, that would be my answer, that I think as a story, yeah, there's something really powerful and deep and resonant about the idea of self-sacrifice and love and grace. But I think in this particular movie, there's this other thread that culturally is so powerful because it hasn't been heard, or it feels like it hasn't been heard and seen before. What do you think? Yeah.
And it seems with there's a darkness there, there's nothing.
Yeah, I think it does. And again, not being an expert on DC Universe, that to me was a little bit surprising as an outsider to say. I feel like I'm constantly being told people don't believe in sin anymore. Sorry.
Just a question to do with violence. I raised it in mind, but it's a constant issue in all of these. How do you, as a Christian, grapple with the use of violence, its limits, its perhaps necessity? Is it redemptive? How do you feel that was dealt with in this movie? Yeah, it's a great question. Okay. I loved that they'd changed the setting from World War II to World War I. There was something about that I really loved, and I'm trying to think through this as I'm talking, thinking out loud here. In terms of the violence, I think perhaps it lowered it a bit, because World War I, you're going back to old school guns and kind of no man's land and that kind of thing, and so it wasn't as, humanly speaking, as violent as I was expecting it to be, but it also reflected the realities of the world in which I live, which is a violent world. But then, yeah, with the scene with Aries at the end, and you mean the violence of that and the violence there, that one for me raises an interesting question, because is there violence in the story of the cross, in the defeat of evil and Satan? Because I don't think we tell the story that way. But where's the connection point there? So I don't know if I have an answer for it. I think it's a really intriguing question. Yeah.
One of the things I noticed is that the movie first came out, it wasn't so much dialogue with people who don't know the Lord, but within the church, I noticed a lot of men feeling quite threatened by the movie.
Yeah, that was interesting. I mean, there was that whole controversy around the female-only screenings of the movie, and that raised a bit of, and I think we're walking a tightrope in our culture at the moment with issues of gender, and the church hasn't necessarily done it any better either. So I recognise that. I think, and part of what I tried to do here is interesting. I figured mostly we would get the women who are here today coming to this, but I'm really glad there's a bunch of guys here, and I hope that hearing a woman's perspective on this is helpful. So I think there are guys who could have talked about this topic and probably would have been much more experts on DC and on the the backstory and all of that. But there's something about what this captures, about gender. Sorry, and I'm getting away from your actual question you asked, which was about the.
I guess it's just that there's certain people that you're friends with on Facebook, or people who write and who contribute to the sort of the YouTube thoughts and ideas on all this stuff and stuff. And say, that's way too feminist.
Yeah.
But they come from a Christian perspective.
Yeah.
How do you do it?
Yeah. And I think maybe it's the same issue we face. I used to use, probably 10 years ago, I wouldn't have called myself a feminist, not because I wasn't, but because I was afraid of what Christians would think by calling myself that, because I think Christians have an uncomfortable relationship with that idea. Now I just own it, and they can get over it. But because I think there's something in feminism. I would call it, I am a Christian actually before I'm anything else. But I think there's something in feminism, as I said, that reflects the heart of God. I think there are people who take it in all kinds of unhelpful directions. But I don't know. I think the church has got to get better at telling our own story in terms of the place of women in it, as in a way that isn't threatening, that isn't about usurping men. And if our culture is doing a better job of that than the church is, then it's no good for us to say, oh, well, that's feminism, that's a worldly thing, you know. So if our culture is doing better at something that I think is actually biblical and gospel, we should learn from them. It's just